Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Foreman. I'm the Student Program Specialist here at the National WWII Museum. For today's webinar, we're going to be talking about World War II and the early civil rights movement. So just a quick reminder, this is a webinar, so we can't hear or see you, and you won't be able to use our chat function either. So to ask questions to your panelists today, use the question and answer feature down at the bottom of the screen that you see there. We'll have plenty of time to answer questions toward the end of our program. I'm very excited to welcome my co-presenter today, Al Wheat. He is the Director of Education at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, where he's been for 3 years, and he's working towards his master's degree at Jackson State University in American History. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, pop them into the Q&A, and we will get to them toward the end of our program. So I want to begin by pointing out that there were several movements for civil rights throughout the course of American history. In these years, during Reconstruction and following the Civil War, states across the South saw over 2,000 African Americans holding public office. Republican-controlled state governments created social programs to assist newly freed people. And as Al informed me just this week, Mississippi actually drafted one of the most progressive constitutions in 1868. That constitution granted full voting rights to African American men and created a public school system in the state, and it protected property rights for married women. Following World War I, when men were returning home from Europe and migrations to northern cities began, it opened opportunities for African Americans to create organized social and political identities. We saw the rise of Black intellectualism. We saw political and labor organizations, the Harlem Renaissance for Black art, literature, and culture, and we even saw the rise of new Black celebrities through sports and mainstreaming of jazz. So we really got to know folks like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and the boxer Jack Johnson. The most recent movement is Black Lives Matter, which started in 2013. This movement for civil rights derived from inequality over policing and violence that targeted Black communities. This very young movement is unfolding yet another political awakening in the United States. The interesting thing about Black Lives Matter is that it's completely grassroots, with no real central organization. This means that the message, their impact, and their activism is completely community-centered and hyper-focused on local issues. That's a very different and rather commendable strategy to empower change that we simply didn't see with many of the other movements that we've mentioned. Other movements were highly organized by civic and political groups who controlled the messaging and often had federal level objectives. We don't have time to mention other movements like the Black Panther movement or the Black National movement, which happened in the 1960s and 1970s, because today we're really focused on what historians call the modern civil rights movement and its early roots in Black activism during World War II. We're going to look at a couple of key individuals in the movement and explore how their contributions set the foundation that ultimately led to the Civil Rights Acts in 1964 and in 1965. I want to really start with President Roosevelt's For Freedom speech on January 6, 1941. This speech outlined the need for the United States to protect democracies of Europe. He identified 4 essential human freedoms threatened by Nazism: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. However, there was an entire population of American citizens that did not enjoy those same essential freedoms at home. African Americans were living in a Jim Crow nation. In the South, overt codified laws completely segregated society along racial lines. In the North, while often not officially law, social constructs limited spaces in which Black Americans were welcomed. Each of these different civil rights movements were met with violent responses from white supremacists. Over 4,000 lynchings of Black men occurred from 1877 to 1950. During that time, Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana experienced the highest numbers of lynchings in the nation. In addition to lynchings, thousands of instances of violence and injustice were perpetrated against Black citizens in both legal and extra-legal ways. Outside of racial terror and violence, the United States systematically segregated all parts of society. For instance, the country had segregated travel facilities and established what was called sundown towns, where African Americans essentially had curfews imposed by local law enforcement. Banking and lending practices called redlining resulted in the creation of all Black neighborhoods, and African Americans who joined the military were placed in segregated units. Many acted as stewards for white officers and frequently placed in non-combative roles. Oftentimes, we saw African American soldiers as unit cooks, supply drivers, and support positions. So the heroic stories of Buffalo Soldiers in Italy, Tuskegee Airmen, and the 761st Tank Battalion are all too often exceptions when speaking of the experiences of African American soldiers in World War II. The same restrictions in social and military life extended to labor practices across the country. While President Roosevelt called for the country to arm Europe in early 1941, African Americans were being denied work in that defense industry. As a result, A. Philip Randolph and other Black leaders met with Eleanor Roosevelt and members of the cabinet to present a full list of grievances and demanded an executive order that ends job discrimination in defense industries. A. Philip Randolph really was not a stranger to political organizing. He was already an active member of the 1920s civil rights and labor movements. He was president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, one of the first majority African-American labor unions. He also worked previously with the Roosevelt administration on the Railway Labor Act in 1934. Through that act, it increased the pay, shortened the work week, and provided overtime pay for railway workers. During their meetings in 1941, Randolph threatened to organize a mass march on Washington of 50,000 African Americans in order to demand opportunities in the defense industry. This tactic would be adopted later by civil rights leaders during the later years of the movement. Today, that's known as the March on Washington. Roosevelt yielded to Randolph's demands and eventually signed Executive Order 8802. Now, that order banned discrimination in wartime industries, but not in the armed forces. This key victory really marks the beginning of what historians consider the modern civil rights movement. In 1942, Randolph began a campaign to end discrimination in the armed forces and in government agencies. Over 18,000 African Americans marched in Madison Square Garden. He continued his activism throughout the war, and by 1947, he was a founding member of the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience. Randolph would continue to be a leader in the movement. He created important alliances with Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin, which are names that we're all familiar with. They worked together toward integrating schools across the country in the 1950s and early 1960s. One of the most powerful leaders of the early movement was Mary McLeod Bethune. She spent 60 years in public service as an advocate for higher education, female and racial uplift, and was a close advisor to President Roosevelt and the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. In addition to founding Bethune-Cookman University, she joined the Roosevelt administration in 1939. She became the director of Negro Affairs in the National Youth Administration. She was the highest paid African American in government at the time. As director, she established the Negro College and Graduate Fund, and it supported over 4,000 African American students in higher education. One of her most significant contributions was the creation of the Black Cabinet in 1936. The cabinet served as advisors to President Roosevelt on issues facing Black communities around the country. She led the cabinet in working on lynching legislation, attempted to ban poll taxes in the South, advocated for federal social welfare programs, and created jobs for African Americans through New Deal agencies. The cabinet also helped draft executive orders that ended exclusion of African Americans in certain branches of the armed forces and also in the defense industry. During World War II, Dr. Bethune was active in mobilizing support for the war effort among all African Americans. She joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and served as a special assistant to the Secretary of War. In that role, she helped establish a training school for Black women to become officers in the Auxiliary Corps. In addition to that work, she supported blood drives, she supported bond drives, and she helped women get jobs in the different canteens which dotted the country. Most importantly, she successfully lobbied President Roosevelt to end segregation in veteran hospitals and rehabilitation centers. After the war, she served as an associate consultant to the US delegation that helped draft the United Nations Charter. During those negotiations, she really focused her efforts on the rights of people living in colonized countries around the world. And in 1949, she represented President Truman during the international trips to Haiti and Liberia, where she received those nations' highest civilian awards. Dr. Bethune was, without a doubt, a force to be reckoned with. She died in 1955 knowing that more work was to be done. Her words in her last will and testament proclaim that tomorrow a new Negro will benefit from more than 330 years of ceaseless struggle. Theirs would be a better world. Throughout the entirety of the early years of the modern civil rights movement, African Americans across the country organized under the banner of a double V. This image first appeared in the Pittsburgh Courier and then quickly spread to other Black newspapers during World War II. It shows that African Americans would need to fight for victory over fascism abroad and fight for victory over racism and Jim Crow at home. During the early years from 1941 to 1957, there were really significant shifts in federal policies concerning civil rights and equality. Under Roosevelt's administration, Black leaders successfully lobbied for the end of discrimination in wartime industries, and Bethune's Black cabinet pushed for major social reforms. A. Philip Randolph's quest to end discrimination in the armed forces, which began in 1942, finally won the day when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in July of 1948. Perhaps one of the most significant debates on federal policy in the very early years of the movement was the Civil Rights Act of 1957. This was under President Eisenhower at the time. And that federal law established the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. So I want to be perfectly clear that the 1957 Act had almost no impact on the African-American voter participation or the conditions that African-Americans were living in across the country. However, the federal debates were so heated, and they actually experienced the longest one-person filibuster in Senate history. This bill was so divisive, and the debates were so divisive, that it would eventually lead to the switching of political platforms, where Southern Democrats abandoned the Democratic Party and created a Dixiecrat voting bloc. Eventually, by 1965, those Dixiecrats are the ones who created the modern Republican Party as we know it today, with their prominently Southern strategy. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Al Wheat, who's going to take us through the remainder of the civil rights movement, picking up from President Eisenhower. So Al?
Absolutely. And we're actually going to backtrack just a bit. Obviously, a bit of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be through the lens of the through Mississippi's involvement in the modern civil rights movement, but it has a very large impact on the national movement as well. All right, so to kind of underline and underscore some of the things that Adam talked about, for a long time, there was this thought that the modern civil rights movement started with two of the events you see pictured here, or people you see pictured here, the passing of Brown versus Board of Education or the lynching of Emmett Till. And as Adam mentioned, it's kind of no longer the accepted idea, because now it's really seen that World War II is kind of lays the groundwork for the modern civil rights movement. And as particularly obvious in historian John Dittmer's book, Local People, where he makes a very concerned effort to make that argument and starts with a scene with these two individuals here for that reason. Who you see pictured here are Medgar Evers and his older brother, Charles Evers. So Medgar actually served in World War II with the Red Ball Express and saw combat in Belgium and France. And his brother Charles served with a combat engineering unit in the Pacific Theater. Regardless, even though they were abroad fighting for people's rights, abroad for freedom and equality, they did not get that same treatment once they returned home, where they were both denied the right to vote. On July 2nd of 1946, Medgar led a contingent of Black World War II veterans through Decatur, Mississippi, in an attempt to vote in the Democratic primary. At the courthouse, they were met by a white mob, where Medgar was quoted as saying, "Some 50 or 20 armed white men surged in behind us, men I had grown up with and had played with." And Evers, once lamented as well that even though he was born and raised in Mississippi, in the Decatur area, he was never actually able to vote in his hometown. So it just shows that even though the veterans were fighting abroad for the rights of people across the world, they did not get that same treatment at home. Another example of that is at a Army base in Mississippi, in Southwest Mississippi, called Camp Van Dorn. Camp Van Dorn was a segregated Army base in Southwest Mississippi, where the 518th Quartermaster Battalion was stationed. And then at some point towards the end of the war, the 364th Infantry Regiment was stationed there, which was a big deal because for the members of the 518th Quartermaster Battalion, it was the first time they had ever seen Black officers. Nonetheless, an all-Black battalion that had access to artillery and larger military equipment. The 364th proved to be quite problematic for the white members of Camp Van Dorn. They showed up to a segregated USO show to forcibly desegregate it. And then there was actually segregated PXs on the base. Post exchanges where you could buy goods were segregated, and they invaded the whites only PX. The 364th was eventually removed from Camp Van Dorn because of their aggressive tactics. because they were not willing to accept the standard of what the U.S. and Mississippi provided them. So Adam talked a bit about the civil rights movement, a lot of the activities that went on. So I want to talk a little bit about the opposition that arose. And some of this opposition, which was born in Mississippi and then spread throughout to other states because it was such an effective and popular strategy. So what you see here is actually an excerpt from Louisiana's literacy test. So literacy tests were obviously one of the ways that governments opted to try to disenfranchise African Americans without explicitly doing so via race, but it was along racial lines that these things were adopted. So you had literacy tests, you had poll taxes, you had grandfather clauses, all that were set up to disenfranchise voters. But Mississippi in particular got really creative with how they decided to disenfranchise voters and try to discourage civil rights activity in general. These methods were adopted by several other states, and one of which was the White Citizens Council, which was formed in Indianola, Mississippi in July of 1954. They were created to provide a more organized resistance to the civil rights movement, which is a really polite way of saying that they were what many referred to at the time as the Uptown Klan. So their goal was to use more legal means and more socially acceptable means to disenfranchise African Americans. And it became very popular in the state and then spread from there. They pounced on communist fears that spread from the war, as well as opposition to a growing federal government, which they felt was getting too large. So they really concealed their racist ideology in conservative values, so that they could kind of somewhat seem like it wasn't just all about the race question, although it obviously was. 2 years later, the Citizens Council of America forms, which bound together several of the state organizations, loosely, but still bound them together. So you had Georgia's States' Rights Council, you had North Carolina Patriots, you had the Tennessee Federation for Constitutional Government, you had the Virginia Defenders of State Sovereignty and Individual Liberties, that all banded together to kind of continue their efforts to maintain segregation and white supremacy. And they did so by making sure they publicized their message. So here you see, this is published and supported by the White Citizens Council from Mississippi, but this article is actually published in Alabama. It's the Selma Times Journal. They created political cartoons to be able to spread their message as well. Here you can see it's veiled behind the encroachment of the federal government on states' rights, quote unquote, but obviously it is based in racist ideology. And they also did so outside of just print with newspaper and, with radio and television programmings, such as the Citizens Council Forum, which is a quite popular television program at the time. But the most lasting legacy and way that they really sought to disenfranchise African Americans was through Citizens Council schools. So council schools were an attempt to create all-white private schools throughout the state so that they could maintain segregation in education. It is not by any means a coincidence that segregation in Mississippi schools really started to end in the late 60s and then was final by the 1970s. And then this pamphlet for a council school meeting is in 68 and 69. That is obviously hand in hand, those two ideals. So the Citizens Council created this kind of templates that other states could use to thwart attempts by the federal government to promote desegregation and integration and equality. The other way that Mississippi did to do so, which is important on a national scale just because of the kind of the audacity that they were able to accomplish this, was through the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. In a nutshell, the Sovereignty Commission was a watchdog agency created by the Mississippi legislation in 1956 in direct response to Brown versus Board of Education, with their expressed goal to do and perform any and all acts and things deemed necessary and proper to protect the sovereignty of the state of Mississippi from encroachment by the federal government or any branch, department, or agency thereof. And they used your basic watchdog methods to do so, although it looked a little different under different governors. So Governor James Coleman used a more muted approach that he compared to the FBI's approach about keeping an eye on what the enemy, quote unquote, proposed to do. They kept civil rights organizations such as the NAACP and the Mississippi Progressive Voters League under constant surveillance, and they kept detailed documents on any time that civil rights activists or civil rights organizations were mentioned in newspapers, both local and national, as well as individuals who may have had meetings or spoke, including national figures like Martin Luther King Jr. They kept files on all of the above. They really came under their biggest moments, so to speak, under Governor Ross Barnett, who you see pictured here. Ross Barnett, famously the governor during the time when James Meredith attempted to integrate the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi, where the National Guard actually was sent in to make sure that Meredith was able to attend the school. And Barnett really uses, he takes his aggressive approach to racism and segregation and white supremacy and gives that authority to the Sovereignty Commission, where they become much more aggressive in turn. So they developed a speakers bureau to give speeches throughout the North and West to try to influence politicians by talking about how great race relations in Mississippi were. And obviously trying to thwart attempts at national civil rights legislation being passed, trying to attempt to stop what eventually would become the Civil Rights Act that were passed in the 1960s. And they also really upped their subversive hunt to define key civil rights leaders in the state, such as Medgar Evers, Charles Evers, Amzie Moore, who Adam had on a slide earlier, who was another World War II vet who was very active in the civil rights movement in Mississippi, as well as some other people that we will see here shortly. And then lastly, the last governor that they really had any power under was Governor Paul B. Johnson, who took a different approach and had the Sovereignty Commission investigate more radical white groups like the Ku Klux Klan, in an attempt to distance the state's leadership away from the negative perception of the Klan, in a hope to showing that the Mississippi government were trying to be good guys so that the federal government would not become involved. Obviously, that did not work out. More interestingly, if you are interested in the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, we actually have those files in their entirety on the Mississippi Department of Archives and History website. They're fully searchable digitally. You can search by name, as you see here, or if you're looking for images, you can do an image search of the thumbnails. Picture here, you see some articles or some handwritten notes. You also see a picture right here in the top. It would be in your top right corner looking at the screen of James Meredith himself, as well as many images, as you can see, of freedom riders or of sit-in protesters who were arrested, and those being their mugshots that you can view on there as well. But there was a lot of positive movement in Mississippi that kind of mirrored what the national movement has, and had national implications. And one of the bigger ones is Freedom Summer 1964. So in the summer of 1964, the Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, was a group of civil rights organizations that came together to really make an impact in Mississippi and bring volunteers from across the nation to hold voter registration drives, education efforts, and the like in the state. So involved in COFO were the Congress of Racial Equality, the NAACP, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. All of these national organizations were coming together to kind of try to attack what they saw as one of the most violent and oppressive states during the civil rights movement. So they established freedom schools around the state to work on education of African-American youth throughout the state, but also to start working towards voter registration. So teaching individuals how to pass literacy tests and the like, to try to, instead of attacking literacy tests at a legislative level to try to get those taken down, just teaching people the strategies to be able to bypass those by passing the literacy test. But what I want to talk about on a larger scale is one of the other aspects of Mississippi Freedom Summer, which was the formation of the Freedom Democratic Party. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was a concentrated effort by COFO to challenge the all-white Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1964. So a group of activists who were part of COFO went to Atlantic City with that expressed attempt. They held protests, they actually were able to get in front of a subset of the Democratic Party so that they could try to make their case for that. One of the most famous people that comes from that is Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, who you see pictured here. Fannie Lou Hamer gives an impassioned speech called her "I Question America" speech, where she establishes quotes and makes such prominent quotes that they're used throughout the rest of the civil rights movement, and quotes that you've probably heard of that you may not know are attributed to Miss Hamer, such as "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." In addition to that, there were others. They attempted to thwart Ms. Hamer's speech because it was getting so much traction. President Lyndon B. Johnson actually called a press conference in the middle of her speech so that the media, national media, would cut to him instead of covering her speech. But that backfires for Lyndon Johnson, as those national media organizations actually air her speech in prime time that night because it was getting so much traction. So through his efforts to try to thwart her speech, he actually got the MFDP more publicity as more people were able to watch it in that prime time slot. So what the Democratic Party, several state delegations agreed to support the MFDP in their efforts to be sat instead of the all-white delegation. But what the Democratic Party does to try to circumvent that and try not to eliminate their white voter base in the South is to nominate or offer a compromise where they would sit the president of the Mississippi branch of the NAACP, Aaron Henry, who you see on the right, and then the white chaplain of Tougaloo College, Ed King, who you would see on the left, as at-large delegates. The MFDP turned them down and went with an all-or-nothing approach to this. So ultimately, they did not get sat, but it created larger dialogues about the issues that were taking place in Mississippi, but also throughout the South. It was a very public expression of that. So it was a really big moment for Freedom Summer and for the Council of Federated Organizations. We obviously can't get into everything involved with the civil rights movement today, but I did want to discuss some of the movements that spawned from the modern civil rights movements, because there are these instances of other organizations or other people taking these ideas and strategies implemented by the modern civil rights movement and co-opting them for their own movements. And one of which stems directly from the civil rights movement via Bayard Rustin, who Adam mentioned earlier. Bayard Rustin was a close friend and worked very closely with A. Philip Randolph throughout the early parts of the civil rights movement. And then he kind of takes a backseat approach during the rest of the civil rights movement so as not to bring unwanted attention to those organizations and activities, because Bayard Rustin was an openly gay man during the 1950s and 60s, which was not well received. So in an attempt to try to circumvent the negative publicity that might bring upon the modern civil rights movement, he worked very much in the background to help organize Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington and the like. But in the 70s, he actually takes the strategies that he developed, learned, and implemented in the movement to really become a big public advocate for gay rights movements in the 1970s. And then another organization that took the methods of the civil rights movement and implemented them to try to get their own causes passed is the American Indian movement. Native Americans at the time were seen as a passive group who would not implement such strategies to try to get the equality that they longed for. And AIM was an opportunity to show that that was not the case. They proceeded to plan marches on and execute marches on Washington. They obviously held mass protests and marches, as you can see here. And even towards, some of the later years of the American Indian movement, developed a more militant strategy, which can be seen in the modern civil rights movement as well. So they really kind of followed the same trajectory in many ways as the civil rights movement. And with that, that is where I will close out my part of the presentation. Adam?
All right. Hey, great. Thanks, Al. So we have a few questions in the chat box, or in the question and answer box. The first one that I'm seeing here is, how much did Mary Bethune make in the government? And that's a really good question, because I did mention that she was the highest paid African American in government, and she was the director of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration, which was a WPA program that Roosevelt established. And she was actually making $5,000 a year, which in the 1930s was actually really quite a bit of money. So she was the highest paid African American in the federal government at the time. She was also the highest ranking Black woman in the federal government at the time, which is really impressive. So let's see. I don't know where that Q&A box, there we go. Were there not some great New Orleans jazz musicians who served in World War II? Yes, there actually were. The two that really come to mind were John Coltrane, who is, I think, the biggest name that was a World War II veteran. He was in the Navy. And then, who else? Dave Bartholomew was in the Army, and he's from, I think he's from Egan, Louisiana. So he's not directly from New Orleans, but he's from a different part of Louisiana. But he was in the Army band, I believe. So yeah, there were several really popular New Orleans jazz musicians who served in World War II. That's absolutely right. Okay, so here's another one. How long did it take for the military to desegregate? That is a really good question. And I love whenever we get questions from students, because that is such a good question. Al, you may need to help me with this one if you can, but in, so Executive Order 9981 was signed in 1948, but the Marine Corps didn't desegregate until like 52, so into the Korea. But they had actually started their integration a little bit earlier, because the Marine Corps started admitting African Americans in 1942 during World War II. But full integration didn't happen until the Korean War, 1951 or 52. So it took several years after the signing of Truman's executive order to actually implement it across all of the different branches of the military.
We were recently looking at some Army rolls from World War I and World War II for some student activities that we're putting together from the department. And it was very obvious because they kept very detailed records of what race and rank each individual listed in the rolls were. So yeah, it did take a bit for that to actually trickle down once the legislation was passed.
Right, right. Okay, here's another one. What are the best books on the segregated World War II quartermaster units? That's a good question. The one that comes to my mind, and now you may have a different one, but the one that comes to my mind is The Road to Victory, which is a pretty comprehensive book on the Red Ball Express, which was a segregated supply unit. So I guess you can consider them a quartermaster unit, but that one is from 2000, I think. So that would be my answer for that one. So Road to Victory is the title of it.
And then one that's, it's not specifically about quartermaster units, but it's kind of the broader picture of Black soldiers in World War II. There's Fighting for America, Black Soldiers, the Unsung Heroes of World War II. That is really good. And I have actually found, I don't know if we have a way to share a link, Adam, but specifically about quartermasters, I found an article from the U.S. Army on former World War II quartermasters recalling their services and what they did in the Army. So if we have a way to share the link, we can do that, but I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, it looks like we can share the link. It'll be in the chat feature, Al. And then make sure you select all panelists and attendants.
Got it.
And that will be able to share your link. Sorry, I needed some off-camera help with that one.
Oh, good.
So, okay, we have another question here. Were there any other minority groups subject to segregation in the U.S. military during World War II? Native Americans, Asians, or Jews? Yes, for the most part, yes. Native Americans were certainly segregated. They weren't segregated into their own units, but they were certainly segregated into their roles. So the most the other largest minority that was segregated into their own units were Asian Americans. So there were units called Nisi units that fought in Italy mostly, and those were all Asian American units. Where they're called Nisi units, which Nisi I think means first generation, if I'm right. Oh, Nisei, sorry. So Al, there's a question for you. So tell us more about your museum. We want to know more about your two Mississippi museums.
Absolutely. So recently, I say recently, it's now December of 2017, we opened the two Mississippi museums, which are sister museums in the same building in Jackson, Mississippi. You have the Museum of Mississippi History that covers all of the history of the state of Mississippi, as well as the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, which is the first state-sponsored civil rights museum in the country. And it is just kind of focuses a deep dive on the years of, I believe, 1945 through the 70s. Both phenomenal museums here in Jackson. We currently are actually offering virtual field trips to the museums for the first time. We are unveiling those or unrolling those within the next 2 weeks. So if you visit MDH's website and you are interested in those are available, and each virtual field trip has a theme, so you can pick from a variety of themes to attend those. Just personally, outside of speaking in my work role, they are great museums that I've toured multiple times, even on my own time, because they just do such a great job of telling the truth quite candidly about the civil rights movement and kind of how Mississippi plays a role in the larger civil rights movement throughout the U.S.
I'll tell you, Al, one of my favorite parts of that, of your museum there is there's a section in the exhibit that shows a filing cabinet from the Sovereignty Commission. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why that's an important feature in your museum and how you tell the story?
The Sovereignty Commission, I mean, in the presentation we talked about it, but just to reemphasize, the Sovereignty Commission really was kind of Mississippi's biggest effort to keep tabs on and help thwart activity of civil rights activists. And in the museum, the exhibit that Adam is talking about, there's a digital filing cabinet that you can touchscreen go through that shows you excerpts from the Sovereignty Commission files on specific individuals. So you can look at some of the files kept on, say, Fannie Lou Hamer, or on Bob Moses, who was a civil rights activist in Southwest Mississippi, as well as in the Delta, very involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And you can just really dive in and see the types of information that were kept on individuals, which really goes to, I hate to say a creepy level, but it was a extreme level of information that they kept on these individuals, from newspaper articles that mentioned their names down to individual conversations that they may have had with secret investigators.
So that really highlights how systemic the move against civil rights really was, and that's a really important feature of your museum, and that's impressive how you all address that and so obviously address that as well. So we have time for one more question, and this one is why did it take so long to desegregate the military? So we were just talking about how, you know, in 1948 it was officially desegregated, but it took several years to actually make that happen. But the African Americans had very different experiences depending on what branch of the military you joined, right? So Navy, if you joined the Navy as an African American, you were often placed in roles of, as a steward to your white officers, as a mess galley, or as a cook, as a janitor on the ship. So you were really regulated to roles that were perceived as being less desirable. The Marine Corps didn't allow soldiers in until 1942, black soldiers in until 1942. If you were in the Army, you were in segregated units, oftentimes in support positions. So the Red Ball Express, your quartermaster units, the male units in the Army were, male being correspondents. Your correspondence units in the Army were mostly made up of African-American women. So in the Air Force, of course, it was segregated units, and the Tuskegee Airmen really had to fight for their place to be able to actually fight over Europe. So they were, African Americans at the time during World War II were really fighting against this idea that African Americans and Black folks could not fight, that they were undesirable soldiers. And that comes directly out of World War I reports from the Department of Defense. Actually, it was Department of War at the time, but from the Department of Defense, they were writing all of these reports saying that African Americans were undesirable soldiers. So during World War II, they were really fighting against this long-standing idea. And that's why it really took so long to get full integration into the military. Al, do you have anything to add to that?
Just gonna say it kind of mirrors how long it took the other aspects of integration to take hold. I mean, for Mississippi, for example, Brown versus Board passes in '54. It takes 16 years before the state of Mississippi mandates segregation in public schools. So it really just kind of falls in line with the trend of how long it took other institutions and organizations to be able to desegregate as well.
Right, and it also goes in line with how long these different rights movements took. So that first right movement, we were, from 1865 to 1877. I mean, that's, a good chunk of years. The after World War I, you're talking well into the 1920s, well up until 1929, the stock market crash. So you're talking another good 15, 20 years. Then for the modern civil rights movement, you're talking about another 30 years. So the whole process of integration and civil rights is just that. It's a process. It's a fight through time. So we are right at 45 minutes. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. Al, thank you so much for joining me today. Your presentation was amazing. Your museums are amazing, and I hope that everyone goes to Jackson and visits whenever it's safe again to do.
And if not, we've got virtual field trips.
And virtual field trips, you're right. So thank you all for joining us. Again, my name is Adam. I'm joined by Al Wheat with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.